what you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughters filed their nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare in its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's leg or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, a rack of lamb, good wine, a good bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There was no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hand, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the nights of anyone, tell your people they can go F themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry." "No," he said. Some of your ears on the floor caught the scrap of his voice. Some of them ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. May 1978.
The Colonel by Carolyn Forsch. So to summarize this poem, it begins with the speaker visiting a colonel's house in Latin America. Detailed imagery and diction describes the setting, which is the home, and these details expose the colonel's luxurious way of life, yet shows that he still struggles with governing after the war. As the speaker eats dinner with the colonel, she is asked how she likes the country, and it seems as though the colonel has a very terse and unkind attitude as he describes governing and its emerging difficulties. The speaker primarily serves as an observer in this scene, and the poem is meant to show the gruesome details of war that the colonel most often deals with. So the antecedent scenario, the speaker wrote this poem in response to the Salvadoran Civil War. She visits the home of the colonel in order to gain some insight as to what his life was like as a leader in the war, and as he still struggles to deal with governing and protecting his people after the war, dealing with human rights. Being in the home of the colonel allows the speaker to see up close the fight for human rights and the burden that it can create on people fighting for it. This poem serves to expose the world to what life is really like after a war and the effects it can have on people. So this poem is not divided into stanzas or sections at all. It is written in one long paragraph, and I think the fact that it's not divided into sections shows how all parts of life can kind of run into each other and have an effect on each other, such as the war that has just occurred before the writing of this poem. The poem goes from a description of the setting and a simple conversation between the speaker and the colonel to a much more gruesome description of the human ears. Although we can't see like a physical break in the poem, there is definitely a shift in tone and attitude. The colonel is described to be more upset and has a very strict, terse tone. The fact that there are no stanzas further emphasizes the effects that war can have on the entirety of someone's life. The climax of this poem occurs when the colonel pulls out the bag of human ears and dumps them out onto the table in front of the speaker. Not only is there a shift in tone and attitude, this scene clearly juxtaposes the seemingly luxurious home and lifestyle that the colonel has and what was described earlier in the poem. Right before and after the climax, the poem focuses on the emotions and thoughts of the colonel, and he describes the struggles of governing and dealing with the past experience in war. Okay, so figurative language. The first one is a metaphor in lines 4 and 5. It says that the moon swung bare on its black cords over the house. This compares the moon to a lamp, showing that the speaker's dinner with the colonel may shine a light over something that she had not known or realized, such as the effects of war. A simile in lines 17 and 18 compares the severed ears to dried peach halves. This simile emphasizes the horror and shock of seeing the remnants of war. Comparing the ears to something so normal in our everyday lives, such as peaches, also emphasizes the disgust the speaker must have felt upon seeing these human ears right in front of her. Personification is used in lines 20, 24, and 25. The speaker personifies the ears by saying that one of them came alive in a glass of water and that they were able to catch the scrape of the colonel's voice. Lastly, an idiomatic expression, keep an ear to the ground, is used in the last line of the poem. This suggests that the victims of the Salvadoran Civil War are still listening and waiting for justice, because this war was based on human rights, and maybe these people are still waiting on that. The skeleton, the curve of emotion of this poem is based on the horrible effects that war can have on people and how it can affect their lives. I think the skeleton of this poem would have a larger hump at the climax, where the colonel's emotions are more clearly expressed. It would be pretty flat before this climax, as the speaker's kind of just describing the setting of the colonel's home, but it would definitely bump up as the tone shifts at the climax, and we're kind of seeing why the speaker is in the colonel's home and why this poem's being written. So this poem does follow a typical bell curve, because the beginning of the poem is just kind of focused on describing the setting and doesn't yet focus on the character's emotions or thoughts, because the speaker doesn't really focus on her own expression or emotion. She's kind of focused on more learning about the colonel. The curve would increase right before the climax of the reveal of the human ears and would slowly fade back down after the climax. This is because at the climax of the poem, the colonel's emotions are clearly expressed and the tone of the speaker is more urgent. So the tone of the poem overall is pretty serious. At the beginning of the poem, I would say it's more laid back, just because it's kind of just setting the scene for the poem. But after that setting is described, it shifts to one of urgency and shock at the climax of the poem. So for Roads Not Taken, the speaker doesn't explicitly say that the poem was about a specific war, but it can definitely be inferenced that the poem was written in an effort to learn more about the effects of a gruesome and impactful event, and that can be war. The speaker also does not delve any deeper into the colonel's thoughts and emotions, other than just to convey to the audience that he was greatly impacted by this catastrophic event that clearly shaped his life, and he still struggles with it as he's pulling back memories from this war, such as the ears.